This is the fun stuff. This is all the stuff I am super passionate about. Dogs and where they came from. Domestic dogs, there is a bit of debate out there as to where we really started domesticating a dog from. Whether it was China, there is certainly links back to China where we had guardian protection lines in China, direct domestic lines that have been found back in China. There have also been dogs sighted and seen as far back as ancient Egypt, in ancient Egypt scripts and writing. We believe that the Egyptians worshipped dogs and found them to be, they revered them. We also have ties and links of dogs working closely with humans back in India, and we're looking at somewhere from 14 to 30,000 years ago. Bear in mind, there is a lot of debate within the scientific community as to where they actually originated from and where we can find the very first domestic dog, because that debate also comes down to what would we class as domestic. Was it still a sheer wolf working with a human, or was it bred by the humans for the purpose of the role that it was doing? Either way, we are looking at dogs who have been working side by side with humans for something like 30-odd thousand years ago, and some bloodlines even longer than that. And as to whether their dog came from the wolf or a wild species of dog is also up for debate. So when scientists have studied the genetic coding and tracked back where that broke down from and came from with our domestic dogs, they've been able to find that a lot of genetic ties and links do come especially from the African wild dog. There are also direct ties and links to wolves though. So we also have genetic coding in certain breeds of domestic dogs, like your Malamute, your Samoyed, Spitz breeds, to wolves. So that genetic line, if we were to put a big graph of it and we were to look at the thousands of years of evolution of the domestic dog, there is genetic tiebacks to both wild dogs and wolves. Does that mean that a domestic dog is a wolf though? Let's dispel a few myths around dogs, domestic dogs, working with them and training with them. Back in the 1940s, ironically, old mate Hitler really loved dogs. I know it sounds crazy that such an awful, evil human being could love a dog, but he did in his own way, and he was obsessed with them. At the same time, all of society was culturally also obsessed with domesticating dogs and breeding them for specific purposes. So we've got a society and a culture, especially in European countries in high society, so very wealthy people, engaged in dog sports and dog breeding and dog showing just for fun. It was entertainment for them. You can think back then they didn't have televisions and social media, so they had to outsource their entertainment, and if it wasn't music or theatre, it was dogs. So we mucked around with dogs a lot back in the 40s, and a lot of our current domestic purebred show lines of dogs came from that time frame, looking at specific Brachyolacus breeds like the bulldogs. Bull terriers actually their lines tie back to the 40s as well. Bull terriers are now such an inbred dog that they have excessive extreme deformities in their bodies. French bulldogs and Aussie bulldogs can't mate naturally because, for the most part, because of how excessively we've tampered with their evolution and breeding, and to get specific looks and physical traits out of the dog. So the focus in the 40s was very much that, and more so than temperament or looking at the dog. So when we're looking at a lot of the funky breeds, we're looking at that's where a lot of those traits have come from. Now, at the exact same time that was going on, so society's obsessed with dogs and loves dogs, we have a scientist, the lovely Schneckel, Rudolf Schneckel, decided to go out and study wolves because he thought, well, I want to know more about these dogs and how to work with these dogs, and dogs are wolves, right? Surely, naturally, even though it's been 30,000 years, they certainly are a wolf. So let's go study the wolves, and then based on what happens with the wolves, that's what we're going to implement with dogs. So essentially, the inference and the study, that's essentially what has happened. Schneckel went out, plucked a whole bunch of wild wolves out of their wild environments and put them in a pen and observed them and studied them and wrote on that. And the pen that they were placed in was approximately the size of this back enclosure. So there was 15 odd wolves that didn't previously know one another thrown into enclosure, and then resources were thrown in with them. And Schneckel and his team observed the behaviours and the actions of the dogs, and they wrote a research article on it. And what they wrote on and decided must have been happening was the wolves, were always fighting. They were always going at one another, getting mad with one another. If resources such as food were placed into the enclosure with them, they all brawled it out and fought for it. And so the drawdown from all of those sort of characteristics and behaviours that they observed in that enclosure was that the wolf must be trying to be the alpha, the boss, dominate everybody else, right? They must be trying to dominate every other wolf in here because why? Well, they must be inherently driven for dominance. They must all be trying to take over and be in charge and bully one another, and I want to be the top wolf in this pack, because in a pack there has to be a top and an alpha, doesn't there? Wrong. What we know now, all right, Schneckel himself actually redrew and retracted his research article about 20 years after he first released it. It was too late. At the same time as culture and society being obsessed with dogs, and that research hit the news and the media, a whole bunch of really popular dog handlers and dog trainers drew inferences from that and said, okay, well, if that's what wolves are doing, and dogs are direct descendants of wolves and they're still XYZ amount like a wolf, so they must also be doing that. So what does that mean? This is how we're going to train our dogs. So we're saying the dogs must be trying to alpha us. They're all trying to dominate us. So if we want to have a good relationship with our domestic dog, we must be the alpha and we must dominate them. We must be the pack leader and on top of them. Now, it's not to say that dogs don't need a leader or a guide, but that's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to take over the world. If they were, I think 30,000 years into this relationship, we would be the subordinate species, if that was what they were out to do and get. What we actually have found out when we have now, with many more scientists going out there, and a current scientist still alive today, he's an older man now, David Misch, who is one of the world's most renowned wolf researchers, has also retracted and said that that's not how wolves actually work, and this is what we're actually observing in their natural environment where they actually are living in the wild. And what we have observed and seen is that wolves, just like human species, do live together in packs, but they live together in packs of parents and offspring. And the parents guide the offspring and they take care of their offspring, but there will be two of them that share the role. There will always be a sire or a stud or a male, the dad of the group, and there will always be the whelping bitch. These two don't fight one another, and they also don't fight their children. There may be times where they guide their offspring, they might guide their pups, they might have to occasionally use physical corrections on their puppies for their own safety, but at the end of the day, and it just makes complete common sense when you say it out loud, it is survival of the species, and so thereby, the mother and father wolf are not there to dominate and assert and boss themselves over one another or their offspring. They're there to care for and nurture their offspring and train them and teach them in the way of being a wild wolf or even a wild dog. And wild dogs also live and grow in those exact same kinds of environments. There is also a documentary on Disney called Kingdom of the Wild Wolf, and I would really encourage you all to watch it. It is definitely my most favourite docu-series. It's very short, it's like a 3-part series of 40-minute episodes, but a researcher and scientist goes out in Antarctica where the wild wolves there have really had no human interference at all because it's in such an isolated area. He goes out and he lives amongst the wolves for a while, an extended period. He's gradually builds his exposure and distance to them to be able to document what he's doing. But it is absolutely incredible. The end is very heartbreaking. There is a mum, her older offspring who are still with her, her newer litter of pups. There is a dad. He observes and documents how they hunt together, how they work together, and the end of a matriarchal bitch and how that happens and who takes over that role in the pack and how that happens naturally as well. There is no particular rhyme or rhythm with it. As David Misch has said as well, observing wild wolves both out in the snow and in Yellowstone and all of the places around the world that he's been studying them, there's no rhyme or rhythm behind why when a matriarchal bitch passes on, who takes over. It is often just the dog who in that instant takes over. There is no particular concept of that one's bossier, so that's the reason they took over, or that was the more stronger personality one. There's no indicator to show that, because you would question and say, well, what is the indicator or line or barrier that we're judging them against to say they're the bossier or the more dominant female? Is it when they're hunting, they're more at the start of the hunt, or is it that they're the one hanging back more looking after mum and pup? So like, how do you give that a barrier line? You can't really. And so what we've observed is that generally speaking, we've got a matriarchal bitch, her husband, partner, dad, dog helping her out that is the current mating male. There may still sometimes be young males in a pack of wolves, most commonly in packs of wild dogs. 100% there are other juvenile younger males. Often it is the younger males that will sprout off to create their own packs. And from a litter, you know, especially with wolves, most of the litter that will survive at some point between that 6 to 8 month mark, a thriving young wolf may leave her pack to go and start her own pack and find her own mate. But there will always be one or two that stick around as well. And it's really beautiful to see that. And in the kingdom of the white wolf, you get to see that. You get to see the matriarch and her 2IC bitch that is her daughter from a couple litters earlier that had stuck with her, and then that one ends up taking over when she wanders off to die on her own. And it's, heartbreaking. I cry every time I watch it, but it's really actually beautiful to observe nature in its true sense and essence. And it will give you great context for what dogs as packs, if they were allowed to be in their wild pack, how they would be behaving. When we're talking about dominance and alpha theory, that just dispels all of that. So unfortunately, because it has been in our culture for such a long time and it has formed so much of how we handle and work with domestic dogs, it is really, really difficult to break our ideas, methodology and way of thinking and verbalising about domestic dogs because of this culture of training that has been put in us for so many years. For 100 odd years now, that's the narrative has been dominance and alpha. It comes down to as simple things as going for a walk with your dog. When I say let's go for a walk with the dog, and I say what does that look like in your head, 99% of the time people will respond with a nice heel, one step behind me. But question why? Why is a nice walk with your dog one step behind you? What a walk is that for your dog? Is that how all walking should be for your dog, for their experience of the world, for the rest of their experience and existence? Well, that theory came from, well, we must dominate them. We must be one step in front of them. God damn, if they think they get to get one step in front, they'll start trying to take over the house and then they'll take over the fucking world. It's so entrenched in us that we don't even realise, without deep analysis of how we're handling the vocabulary we're using and why we're talking about it and doing certain behaviours, training dogs with certain ways, we don't even realise we're doing it until we're doing it and take a step back and look at it and go, oh my God, I'm doing it again. And I know from myself that because that cultural message of dominance and alpha has been so entrenched in us, even for me, with all of my knowledge and experience around working with them, I still fall into that trap at times. We're not going to say that dogs don't need a guide and that you aren't the guardian of the dog. We are a higher consciousness than the dogs. As far as we know, our frontal cortex works and theirs doesn't because they don't speak English. There will be times where we need to, for the sake of safety and care for the dogs, and particularly in the environment that we are working in, be that guardian and be that leader for that dog. But when we're talking about being a good leader, we're not talking about dominating. We're not talking about alphaing or being on top of. We're not trying to break the spirit of. Who's heard that before? You have to break the dog. Yeah, yep. No, why would you possibly want to break your dog? Your dog's not broken, mate. So really identify what that distinction is between being a good leader and a good guardian and a good guide for the dogs that you're working with and handling versus dominating, bullying and coercing them, because there is a distinction. The line might be somewhere here between how that is, but there is a clear distinction. So I'm certainly not saying that when you come into your shifts or when you're out in the world or with your own dogs, that your dogs get to just run amok and make their own choices and here's the credit card, off you go, have fun with your world. No, being realistic, again, we're the higher consciousness. We make decisions for our dogs, but it's for the welfare of them and it's giving them as much autonomy as we possibly can within that role. A good leader, a good guide, when you think in your mind of somebody who's a good leader in your life, did they ever yell at you? Did they ever bully you? Did they ever intimidate you? Did they make you feel like a lesser being? Good leaders and guides don't do that. So that's what we need to be for the dogs that we have in our world. We also then draw back on, so that gives you a history and an understanding of where the domestic dog has come from over all those many years, right? And where that cultural concept and idea of being the alpha and being the dominant also came from, and dispels for you that that is actually, in fact, not scientific. It's been disproven as not being scientific, and the correct ways to work with dogs. So then we go, all right, well, great, we know that now. So what's on the flip side? How do we work with our dogs? Okay, we want to be their guide, we want to be their leader, but there are many influences and elements to your dog, both visible and invisible, that are influencing the observable behaviours. So when you're in here in the room and you have 15 dogs or 10 dogs, 2 dogs, however many in front of you, and they're displaying certain behaviours, whether it is great play behaviours or whether it is excessive nuisance behaviours, humping, mounting, barking, whatever, there are things influencing it that there are so many factors influencing the observable that in this environment and context can be very overwhelming for you all to understand. But giving you at least a little bit of understanding of it will help you at least be able to work with those particular dogs, or all dogs. So, you know, before we even proceed with the behaviour modification side and we start saying, all right, so the dog is nuisance barking and we don't like that, we want to modify that. Let's pull back, identify and ascertain, why is the dog nuisance barking? Okay, why does a dog bark? Dogs bark because it's fun. It's as simple as that. There's no other real reason beside the fact that it's fun and it releases emotion as well. So the true scientific reasons why we can definitively say dogs bark is that for the most part, it's pack driven and it's a fun activity to do and it's an expression of emotion. And the most common examples of where we see that happening, so expression of emotion, I'd say actually would come first. So one particular dog has something to say about something literally with their bark. So they want to say something about how they're feeling. But when they're in community and in pack environments, others who chime in and bark with them, it's just for fun. It's not because they even know what is going on. And to give you a perfect example, I have 6 dogs currently. In my home, I have one very noisy dog. Now, if I was to do the switch on and off of any behaviour, it would be to stop him barking. But Monster likes to tell me all about his emotion. I think it plays a huge part in his ability to absorb people and other dogs' emotions because he's like a sponge. His therapy work really sees him take in and absorb the emotion, particularly of broken, sad and traumatised people. So he knows inherently that those people need extra, and he'll sit there and let you hold him, touch him, poke him, prod him, do anything to him to try and make you feel better. Then he has to go and release that somewhere, and he has all that emotion in him. So that's where we talk about decompression for him, and his way of coping is to vocalise. So when he's feeling any level of emotion at all, he immediately goes to vocalisation. The other 5 dogs in my house can be nowhere near him. He can be at the back of the 5-acreage paddock, right down the back, barking at the cow, because how dare you moo cow, and this is my property. I've got a lot to say to you about how I'm feeling about you being bigger than me and on the other side of that fence. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, well, old mate Mello, sleeping under the bed in the front of the house 5 acres away, hears that. Do you think from there, okay, maybe science doesn't know this, but maybe in his bark, he's telling her what he's doing. We don't know. But Mello will chime in. And because Mello's chimed in, then Benji will chime in because Benji is Mello and they're like this together. They're 4 months apart in age, grown up together. What one does, the other does. So she'll start, so he'll start. He'll start and Ellie will go, wait a minute, you 2 are barking, I'm also going to bark. Then Ellie goes, Mum's barking, so Cherry starts barking. So now I've got 4 of them all barking at me. Now those decisions and that behaviour happens like that, right? So I observe it and I see and I know what exactly I can see it within a split second of each one barking what the other one is doing and why they're all copying one another. But they're all just doing it in the house because it's fun and it's great and we love to vocalise together because that's what we do together. Think of it as humans having a nice drink at a pub and doing a nice big cheers together, and because everyone else is doing it, we're all going to start chiming in and chanting or stomping our feet and doing a dance. It's a very similar concept for dogs. So for the huge part, that's where their barking comes from and why they're barking. So it is really important when a dog is displaying a particular behaviour that for us to actually be able to modify it, we identify why they're doing it. Is it genetic? Is it history? Is it coded in them? And is it in fact fair for us to have an expectation to modify that choice of the dog? Again, we live in a society where dogs have been domestic for so many years now that we do have this expectation of being able to switch on and off certain behaviours in them, and that is just not fair or realistic. You can't just say to a dog who wants to express himself vocally, stop talking. I am a person who likes to talk about things I'm passionate about. We would not even for a split second consider saying to a human, stop being a vocal person and communicating how you feel. Would we? Never. Then why is it okay to do it to our dog? It's not really, is it? Now, let's talk about the context of BBs. So, it may mean that certain vocal dogs are not in fact suitable to be in this space. And that ties beautifully back into my initial discussion on this is not necessarily the space where dogs should be socialising in groups. And we do certainly, because of that, have our restrictions. And one of those restrictions is noise levels and the fact that barking is fun and a pack-driven fun activity, and that just removing one that's a nuisance barker can change the entire space of 50 other dogs. It happens all the time when I'm on the floor and I say, give me X, Y, Z, and I put them into the puppy palace for some decompression and calm and quiet, and what do you know? All of a sudden there's 60 to 70% less barking. Doesn't mean we have no barking. Again, it's a fun emotion and they're here to have fun and they're playing, and in play they might vocalise just for fun, and that's not a problem. But nuisance barking just for the excessive excitement of being here, or again, we identify, we say, okay, so we know that about barking and that's where it's drawn from, and it's an emotional reaction from the dog. So is that a good emotional bark or is it a negative emotional bark? And trying to decipher and identify if based on that, it means the dog is or is not suitable for the space. We never want to be servicing dogs in here that aren't suitable for those reasons, that it is creating more stress and hyper-arousal for them than positive benefit. Owners kick back on me for that, but there are a handful of dogs here at the moment who that is my current battle, is the owner, not the dog. We know what the dog needs, we know how to help the dog, and most often it's not having them here. The owners think they always know best. So that if you have a dog in your enclosure that is doing that, rest assured, 99.9% of the time, I am aware of it. I am working on it. It's not to say that we tolerate it or allow it to continue while the dog is in our care. So if you have a dog in your room that is doing that, and I would say 10 to 15 minutes would be an absolute maximum capacity I would be allowing a dog to nuisance bark for, before I would be saying, and at the same time, and we'll go through it in module 3, there are steps and strategies for working with the dog to offer them alternatives. So I'm not just saying, well, they come in and they're barking, we're just going to let them do that. There are training methods and models we can implement and ways to try and help and settle the dog. And if they work, fantastic. But if after a 10 to 15 minute session it's not working, that dog cannot stay in the room if they are continuing. It creates immense disruption for you guys and for the rest of the dogs that they are socialising with. And in this indoor space, it's simply not appropriate. Again, when you're working with the dogs in the room, while for the most part we might say doggy daycare as a space is for dogs to come in to play with one another, it also has other benefits and reasons. And there will be some dogs that come here simply for exposure to other dogs. They may actually not ever be at the point where they learn how to play. A lot of dogs that come in from that older mark 6 or 8 months on that didn't do puppy schools, they didn't see any puppies after they left their litter mates at 8 weeks. You know, in that few month bracket, they miss that learning opportunity of how to play and how to have fun with other dogs. And so for those pups, we're working on them at a different angle, and it can be more about building focus. They're still socialising, but they're socialising in a way that's suitable for them, not by that classic concept of play. As far as species and play goes, a very interesting thing I've been researching and looking into is that because I've been curious about something in my own home context with my 6 dogs. My oldest one, Mello, also like Benji, is at 11 years of age now. And now, just most recently, you all know Penny, my little chocolate puppy. She's the same mixed breed that Mello is. They have similar traits, and that's why we got her. We wanted her to be a little friend for Mello, and I kid you not, I could drop dead every time I actually see Mello play. At 11 years of age, she still wrestles, does zoomies, does mouthy stuff, does little nips and puppy nips on the bum to get Penny to move. And I'm thrilled by that. I'm like, that is exactly why we got Penny. Thank the Lord, they're friends. But I also observe her and I think, wow, that's really interesting, because besides humans, no other species of mammals do that, and dogs. Humans and dogs, we're the only 2 species in science and that we have observed that once reaching maturation or adolescence, continue to play. Humans play as adults in different contexts and ways. We look at group sports, we look at fun activities, what we're all going to do later this afternoon with bowling. Dogs too, no matter their age, like to play. And they like to play with boys and with girls. The gender doesn't matter to them. You'll find mixed breeds and mixed genders often wrestling and playing. And there are some dogs who are more driven for it than others. Some, the ones especially coming to doggy daycare frequently, especially even as they're aging, because they have that constant exposure and they're amongst other dogs, they build that rapport and that friendship and go, yeah, I'll play with you. And they don't care that they're 5 or 6 and the other dog's a 3-month-old puppy. It's fun, and this space is for fun and play, and dogs need that. They need an area to be able to play. So just an interesting observation for you all is that, and that not just myself, but science as a whole, I've been researching it because of my own observations in my home environment, but science as a whole has really shown us that dogs keep their ability and desire and want to play for a really long time, forever really, and just like humans. So it is a really cute, little interesting tying bond that humans and dogs share as 2 separate species. We both actually have those same ambitions and drives. When we're looking back at behaviours on dogs and what they're actually actively engaging in, so back in that example of the barking behaviour, and we say, all right, what is actually a reasonable expectation for the behaviour modification of a dog? So at what point should we say, no, training is not appropriate? Now, one of the things I teach clients when I'm working with them with training their dogs is assess whether it is suitable to modify the dog's behaviour choice or whether it's more suitable to modify the environment the dog is in. 99% of the time, the environment change is more important than trying to change the thought process or decision that the dog is making. Kim Brophy is amazing. She is an applied ethologist in the USA. She's been working with dogs for 30 odd years. We are going to do some upskilling for team leaders around some of Kim's work because it's incredible and it really gives you a really good understanding of working with dogs. And over all her years, so just so you all understand what applied ethology is ethology is the study of wild animals, particularly more in captivity, observing wild animals, their behaviour choices, what they do, why they live out their lives, how they do, how they source their resources and food and whatnot, how they behave amongst one another. And then applied ethology is looking at those same animals but in a captive environment, and how can we fulfill for those wild animals that same kind of enriching life experience that they would have if they were in the wild. Kim particularly has, from applied ethology and studying that, delved into dogs, and she's a specialist in working with companion dogs. One of the things that she found through her research and study was that as an industry and culturally as a whole, we're so fixated on changing the decision of the dog when it's not always appropriate to do that. And one of the things she developed and the entire dog training industry is embracing now, 10 years on, is the LEGS model. And LEGS is a really great sort of shortened acronym and way for you to identify the different components of the dog and identify at what point do we do the learning part versus whether it is environment, whether it is genetics, and whether it is the actual self of the dog. So LEGS makes up your dog. So LEGS is your learning, so your dog's experiences and education, and that comes from how as an owner they're socialising the dog, they're working with your dog, taking them out, what are you exposing them to, but also not just what you as the owner are doing with them, but what they themselves are experiencing out in the world, independent of you, how they learn about their backyard and situations, noises, birds, balloons. The domestic world has a lot of interesting things for dogs to learn about in their environment. Trucks, noises, trams if they're in a city, trains, going on a train. Dear God, there is so much that a poor dog needs to learn about. The next would be the environment. So how many aspects of the environment are impacting the dog, such as being in the doggy daycare space, that environment. Again, it may not always be suitable for all dogs. In fact, it's unsuitable for more dogs than it is suitable for dogs to be in this particular indoor daycare space. Not to say that that means those same dogs in that category are unsocial or shouldn't be amongst other dogs, but in this indoor particular space may not be their environment. Genetics, so the DNA that designed our dogs both inside and out, and that is a really heavy one. We've gone back on the fact that dogs, domestic dogs, as far back as we can 100% document, are around that 30,000 years, right? So for 30,000 years, we have been developing certain breeds of dogs to do certain jobs, and that is genetically coded in them. When we look at epigenetics, epigenetics is the human manipulation of genes and how genes change. So your genetics and your DNA coding can change based on your environment, based on selective breeding. Something absolutely incredible that we've learnt through epigenetics is how much with breeding of dogs traits are passed down. So let's look at anxiety and stress and look at dogs bred in mass production spaces. So you have a beautiful dog, let's say in the context of the world, is socialised, exposed, balanced and happy. That dog finds itself in a home space and environment where that is no longer its experience of the world, and it's locked in a cage all day. Being locked in that cage creates stress and turmoil in the inner being of that dog. 6 months into living like that, or a year into living like that, we breed that female dog. That female's puppies will have stress and anxiety coded in their DNA. So it is super important to look at breed traits and genetics and breeding when we're looking at what is or is not appropriate to modify or change in the dog. Domestic breeding, 90% of domestic bred breeds would not exist if natural selection and evolution was undertaken without human involvement. So if we plucked ourselves out of the picture and we allowed dogs to interbreed on their own independent of us, nature would not have created the animals we have created, simply because it's not smart survival. And many times, like the bulldog that cannot even mate naturally, they just would not survive in the wild like that. There are other species of animal that are domestically bred that humans have played with for so many hundred years of breeding that also would not have existed and wouldn't survive. Certain cattle types and hoofed breeds of animals that we factory farm. But especially at the top of that rung is our dogs. We breed them for particular traits that we like in them, but that doesn't mean that in the wild and in nature they would have existed, and thereby that's our responsibility. We created you, we now have to accept responsibility for that. One of the biggest things we've bred dogs for is interdependence on humans. So we have dogs now that don't actually know how to cope independently. They literally, by their genetics and coding, require constant guidance and constant reassurance and constant input to be happy and live a fulfilled life in our environment and space. Okay, again, that's fine, that's where we are. I would not take back any of my dogs for $1 million, but I also have to accept that as a human species, we've done that to our dogs, and it is our responsibility from this point to guide them and change our environment to suit them. The interior self of a dog is also so important, looking at their individual personalities, their sex and gender, like what are their preferences, what they do and don't like. One of the biggest things that we've taken away from dogs is their freedom and autonomy to roam and be in nature. a lot of dogs spend more time indoors in a house environment than they do outside. That's not the natural genetic coding and way a dog should be living. That creates a whole bunch of its own problems. So it is super important when you're looking at particular dogs, when you're working with your particular dogs, we're looking at legs and going, okay, how much can we change here? And how much do we just have to accept is the dog that we've got in front of us? At BB's, we look at training in a force-free way. I'm including this to give you some context and understanding of why force-free. So the principles of learning apply to essentially all mammals and species. We're looking at positive and negative reinforcers, right? So in the world, there's reinforcers around all of us for ourselves and of course for our dogs as well. So when we're learning about the world, negative reinforcers are sometimes keep us safe and healthy. A good example of a negative reinforcer is a traffic stoplight, red light system. The negative reinforcement of the traffic light and stopping at it is you're scared of getting a fine and you're scared of dying. So the negative reinforcement of either dying or getting the fine makes you stop at the red light, correct? The positive reinforcement on the other spectrum of it is you don't die and you don't get the speeding fine. So in that exact context, we have both happening. When we're training with our dogs, a lot of the time there may be both happening as well. When we talk about wanting to achieve the best outcome though, we've learnt, and science has taught us, and this again goes across the spectrum of learning as a whole, that positively reinforced and without coercion and force has a much bigger, longer lasting impact than using a negative reinforcer. So we're looking at punishments. Now, with a dog, it's super tricky and important that if we're going to be looking at using a negative reinforcement, we understand scientifically how it works. The dog understands that what you're doing when you're punishing them is in a direct identification to the particular behaviour you didn't like and not getting it confused. When we do a positive reinforcement, if the dog gets confused when the treat was delivered maybe too early or too late, it actually didn't impact anything. It didn't impact your relationship with the dog. It didn't create a bigger picture problem. But using a negative reinforcement absolutely does. It tampers with your relationship and your trust with your dog. And if it isn't delivered correctly, it actually doesn't have an impact bar damaging your relationship and your dog losing his confidence. That is why we don't want to be using punishments when we're working with pups in any context, especially in this space. An example here I've given is that the nose tap or the smack on the rump for a dog. Now that is a classic sort of way that traditionally, because dogs are trying to dominate us, we train them not to, is by giving them a smack, pushing them down, using your knee to knee them in the chest if they jump at you, or a nice big whack on the nose, or even rubbing their nose in their wee if they've done a wee in the wrong place. All of these sorts of behaviours and delivering those sorts of behaviours to a dog happens with your hands. What do you think that does to the dog's association of hands? Because they associate really fast. Fear, right? So now you've got a dog that's fearful of your hands. Now you've got a dog that you need to clip a leash to, getting right up close to their face where you had just smacked them 10 minutes ago on the face. Do you think they're going to be okay with your hand coming near them? For a punishment to be effective, so can it be effective? Yes, absolutely. None of us like being knocked over the head. If every time you tried to stand up, I smacked you over the head, how many smacks over the head do you think it would take before you stopped trying to stand up? A smart dog, maybe one, but unlikely. Possibly usually with dogs, it's a practice of 2 or 3 times. Smart, which is literally what I have put down here at the bottom. For punishment-based training to be effective, it should only have to be performed once or maximum twice, and the dog should no longer display that behaviour. If they're continuing to display the behaviour, you know that your punishment was not effective and did not actually work. They did not identify that negative behaviour that you didn't like with the punishment. They're continuing to practice it. Now all they think is that you're an asshole and that you like to hit them or yell at them or yank them on the neck. They don't actually know otherwise. They just think, well, fuck you. I don't want to be around you. For it to be effective, it needs to be delivered immediately, and it needs to be more forceful than the behaviour the dog displayed itself as well. And then you draw that line. Again, how long is a piece of string? How forceful? So we've got people putting shock collars on dogs, kneeing dogs, pinning dogs to the ground with the knee until they defecate themselves. At what point do we draw that line? Is it just a yank to the neck? Or is it a shocking the shit out of their neck, right? At what point do you say that that punishment was appropriate for the force of behaviour? bearing in mind that using force and punishment on a dog, aggression breeds aggression. And again, that is a concept and principle of learning across all species of all mammals. If you start to experience aggression, it will grow aggression in you. It is inevitable that if you expose a being to aggression, that they will learn it and then possibly practice it. Most often, yes, practice it. They may not practice it immediately, they may not practice it in the exact instance, but they will at some point. And when we're talking about a dog, a different species to us, I don't know how many of you are going around biting people, but dogs have teeth and they will bite if they eventually are pushed to that point. So it is really, really important that, one, I never want to see staff members using force or punishment-based training at BBs, and the reasons being associations as well. So if a dog comes here and all they experience is constant punishments for behaviours that are just being a dog, like barking, all they associate with that is negativity towards humans, negativity towards being amongst groups of dogs. So now you're developing behaviour patterns of dog reactivity with other dogs because that's what they start to associate. And then ultimately, over enough time, fear of entering or being, one, at this company around us, and more importantly also just around dogs and people in general in the bigger public. There's a handful of dogs coming here at the moment who have been in other spaces where punishment-based training is the only type of training. And you will notice that those dogs skirt around you, avoid you. It is very challenging to get them to recall. It does happen, and over time we override it and we can build their trust, and we do that with a lot of positive exposure and positive reinforcement and really yummy treats. And also the bigger thing is by treating the other dogs around them with kindness, they observe that and they learn from one another, and they learn, oh, the other 15 dogs in the room are cool with this. Number 16, who has had those bad experiences, starts to learn to relax and builds that trust with us, and ultimately build back trust about being amongst dogs and amongst people. That then leads to, okay, so Jess, you don't like us to do that. And it is a very overwhelming and frustrating environment at times when you do have 15 of them all being crazy psychos. So you go, okay, well, you don't want me to yell at them, smack them, push them around or punish them. Great, I can get on board with that, but what do you want me to do? These are the real life examples and things that we can start implementing in the enclosures to make life easier for you all. The training model that we practice here is redirection model. And it is literally as simple as that, redirect them. There's a behaviour trait that you don't like mounting, maybe lip curling, snarling, barking. You don't like them doing these certain things. Look at those behaviours, identify do your legs, where is it coming from? Is it something I can actually stop? Herding dogs, circling the room barking. Do you think that you can actually stop a border collie's drive to do that? Unlikely, so let's not even bother. And then going, all right, we've done legs, we can modify or change this behaviour. Let's redirect them into something we do in fact like. So we want to be redirecting them into positive behaviours that we can positively reinforce for. Sometimes those positive behaviours might actually simply mean being removed from the room and being put in a Zen den or a timeout. It's not a bad thing that happens for a pup. Having a licky mat, something calm to do, that's a positive thing they're engaging in. And by doing that, they're not out here humping, harassing, grabbing at your clothing, whatever it is they were doing.